Hello, good lunchtime, and welcome to the London Review Books Lunchtime Euro series. Kind of auspicious day ahead of the England-Germany game. My name is Peter Geoghegan, and I'm the investigations editor at Open Democracy. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm Irish, and I'm an Irish fan, so I don't really have much interest in this year's competition, but I'm going to do the best I can to feign some of it for the next hour. And it's much easier because I'm here with John Lanchester to talk about the last 16 and what's coming up tonight. And John, as I'm sure you'll know, is award-winning novelist, writer, and crucially, as well as being an obituary writer and a restaurant critic in his previous life, he also was a football reporter, and he's been the LRB's resident football writer pretty much since Italia 90. And I've lots of memories of Italia 90 myself. For me, it's Paki Bonner's save against Romania in the last 16. But I'm sure for many others, it's something slightly different. And of course, England's 1990 World Cup ended in a penalty shootout with Germany. So it's going to be interesting now, 31 years later, the prospects of that happening. Who knows? Maybe that's something we'll sure be talking about. But before we move on to England, Germany, John, I think it's worth reflecting on what went yesterday. I think for a lot of people, it's been a bit of a slow burning tournament. A lot of people saying, well, how good is it? 32 teams, some teams not quite as good as the others. I'm talking from Scotland. But yesterday it really came on fire. Spain beat Croatia 5-3, and then in the evening thinking, well, this is going to be quite dull. Switzerland, who always seem quite dull, against France 3-3, and then France, the reigning World Cup holders, go out on penalties. So what did you make of it?
Hello, Peter. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Amazing night. You quite often get with tournaments, there's a point at which it sort of catches fire, takes light. I think especially with this, disputable format of 24 teams. So, was it 4 out of the third place teams go through? So that's slightly an incentive to, cagey point counting play in the qualifying group, and you do need that moment when the feeling of it kind of coming to light. And instead we had a double dose. I mean, it was absolutely astonishing, particularly odd. I don't think I've ever seen that thing before, of 2 consecutive very high scoring games that had the same pattern. A team going 1-0 up, then being pegged back 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, then 2-3, 3-3, then extra time. That was really slightly dreamlike, I thought. Admittedly, I'd had a couple of drinks by the time the second game, France-Switzerland, came along, but there was that edge of, almost hallucination about it.
Yes, in both encounters at around the 75-minute mark, I was kind of thinking, well, this is kind of over now. These 2 games, and they'd both been very entertaining, especially when Paul Pogba scored for France, scored this absolutely blistering and really insouciant strike from about 25 yards out, and just kind of stood there with his arms out in a kind of pose. And he's got this really, like, his hair is this, streaked hair, and he just looks, he looked every bit this amazing footballer, this footballer that Man United had spent £100 million on. And it just felt like that is completely done and dusted. If there's going to be another goal in this game, it'll go to France. And actually, my girlfriend was coming up to my house, and I live here in the West End of Glasgow. My window was open because unusually it was quite warm. And when Switzerland scored to make it 3-2, you could hear me going, ooh, out the window in this kind of cod Irish accent, because I went, oh God, that's surprising. Is anything interesting going to happen? And then Switzerland had a chance. They had a kind of chance that looked like they might score, and they didn't. They missed it. And then they scored this fantastic goal to make it 3-3 with about 3 or 4 minutes left. And I just thought, this is, on top of the 5-3 game earlier in the day, this really was a kind of moment where you can see people, it came alive, because sometimes in the last 16, actually, it can be a bit dull, as you say, it can be a bit point scoring. People are playing for penalties, but it felt like neither of those 2 teams were playing for penalties.
No, it was. And I agree at the same point. When Pogba scored, I thought, okay, that's it, done and dusted. Because, Croatia are a good team. They famously were runners up in the last World Cup, knocked England out in the semi-final. So I was less astonished, Croatia coming back to peg Spain back to 3-3, it was a very, very dramatic, but not kind of on the face of it astonishing. Whereas one of the interesting things, when Switzerland went ahead 1-0, that's the first time Switzerland had ever been ahead of France in a competitive match. They'd never gone up against France. So the fact that they pegged them back after Pogba's goal was absolutely astonishing. I mean, one thing I would get when I watch Pogba play for France is how annoying it must be if you're a Man U fan, because he does look like a different player. I mean, he's so commanding and so at his ease. He's one of the, in fact, the French team in general, but Pogba maybe in particular. He reminds me, I think, Carl Miller, who's the founding editor of the LRB, who's obsessed with football and you know, a deep love of it from way back in the day. And one thing he used to say is, if you want to find out who the most talented player in any team is, ask who's the player who people have doubts about his temperament. And it's such a revealing thing, because what that means is there's someone who, when they're playing well, they make it look so easy that when their game is slightly off, it looks like they're not trying. It doesn't look like they can attain this freak peak of perfection that no one can sustain indefinitely, which is actually the reality of it. It looks like they're not trying as hard. And I think Pogba has a touch of that, and perhaps France in general have that. There's that thing that they sometimes look like they, you know, they sort of zone out a bit. It's a bit like Roger Federer in tennis. I always think Federer never looks like he's beaten. He just sometimes looks like he's a bit off his game, or he's not really concentrating, and the other person sort of wins by accident. And, you know, I thought France had a touch of that last night.
What was interesting too, I thought, was he's not of that same stature, but he's had a lot of criticism too. Granit Xhaka for Switzerland, who plays for Arsenal, very, very criticised for Arsenal. And it is a bit, you know, the commentators were talking about a quarterback yesterday, but he was like, he did kind of sit really deep and ping these amazing passes. And every time he kind of seemed to play this role of both holding midfielder and kind of maestro pulling the strings. It was like a mix of Luka Modric and Kante put together, and I thought he was absolutely fantastic. And you could see, you know, you could just see the intensity of his play. And without him, I don't think Switzerland would have been in the races at all. He was, I think, the difference as well. Like they've got talented players, and I thought the strikers were very good too. And they've got this kind of spine of, you know, in some ways, actually a lot of Balkan immigration. You know, Croatia lost, but in some ways, Croatia won yesterday too. A lot of the goals were scored by people of Croatian extraction for Switzerland. What turned out to be the crucial goal was scored by a Dinamo Zagreb player. But huge talent. But I just thought he was fantastic.
I thought he was incredible. Actually, I must admit, I didn't know he was capable of that. I mean, my wife happened to be watching the latter half of that game, and she did bring up the question of you know, why is everybody from the former Yugoslavia or the Balkans? And they've certainly been a great gift to Swiss football. I was able to explain that, you know, it's a bit like in pop music. It's Dua Lipa and Rita Ora. You know, it's that. It's that, only it's not pop music. It's football, and that seemed to make the point. But yeah, they have. I mean, it's the most diverse thing in the whole country is the football team by miles. But that player Xhaka, he in a sense is what England don't have. That thing about a sort of, the metaphor I use is an impresario. You know, sort of arrange it, set it up, control the tempo, hit those. You know, both hit those passes and also do that thing that Kante does extraordinarily well. Of I think it's a bit like in sculpture, what they call negative space. You know, it's the things that a player stops the other team from doing. I mean, Kante's an extraordinary figure for that. His runs quite often sort of blocking people off, shutting down passes, shutting down angles. He has this huge consequence on what the other team does, and I think that combination of playmaking and control is the big hole in the England setup, in an otherwise pretty talented England setup.
I guess this is, you know, brings us very neatly onto tonight's game, because I do wonder. It feels to me, you know, having watched England and Germany, they do in some ways feel like two flawed teams, actually. Two teams with quite, like, compared especially to France, but to some of the other teams we've seen over the last 16 as well. Belgium and others, even though Belgium's game was quite dull the other night. But these are teams that you look at them and go across the spine of the team. There's a lot there. Whereas it does feel like two very, very well-established footballing nations that are kind of, not really sure about what exactly it is that they're doing right now.
Yes, I mean, I think we'll know a lot more come 7 p.m. on that. But I think I mean, in a way that maybe the trajectories, I mean, I totally agree. I think they're arriving at that point in a slightly different way because, you know, it was interesting that Germany kept Joachim Löw on after the World Cup because he's been in post a long time. He was Klinsmann's assistant. Klinsmann brought him in 2004, and then he took over in 2006. And you know, that's 15 years, a long time for an international coach. And obviously, you know, he won them the World Cup, but then, you know, they were, not to put too fine a point on it, they're absolutely dire in 2018. That's I think the worst performance I've ever seen from German national side. And there is that sense of having been there a bit too long, partly, I have to say, exaggerated by how they dress. You know, they wear this weird things. Because someone said about them in 2018 that they look like the world's oldest boy band, the managerial team, but they're wearing the same outfits. They've got the same haircuts, and they were the world's oldest boy band 3 years ago. And so there is that slight sense of, you know, bit past their peak, slightly in decline, not quite having a kind of a dominant thing. And Southgate's side are much younger, have a lot of potential, but again, perhaps haven't quite, you know, crystallized. So there is that sense of, you know, with France, you have the kind of spine of Mbappe, Drogba, not Drogba, sorry, Pogba, Mbappe. With Belgium, you have De Bruyne, who I think is the best passer of the ball in world football, and one of the best I've ever seen, categorically, and Lukaku. And there isn't quite that thing of a kind of central spine in either side, which is one of the reasons it's going to be quite interesting tonight.
Yes, I think that, and there's something as well about, you know, even especially for Germany, I think the boy band metaphor is probably apt as well, in that they've brought back quite a few of the members from the previous iterations as well.
Yeah.
You've got like Thomas Muller and Mats Hummels, and you're like, wow, you guys are still there. And
Yeah.
Joachim Löw's got a little bit of a Paul McCartney vibe going on as well. He's denying his own aging as well. It's kind of like, if I keep dressing and looking identical, maybe it won't happen. But I think that's going to be, yeah, it's what's interesting too, maybe, is that whereas at certain times, like, I'd love you to talk a bit more about like kind of the history of this fixture, but it's felt like sometimes this has been almost the key fixture of a tournament, and maybe not just for England, because Germany would, for so long, you know, for all my decades of watching football, Germany have always pretty much been a team to beat. And if you beat Germany, you're in a really, really important place. You're in a place where you might actually just win a tournament because they will be in the final against you. And it feels like this fixture, probably for people outside of the respective countries, probably doesn't occupy the same place as this being the potential winners. It's an interesting fixture as part of a last 16, but, you know, compared to some of the other teams around, it probably doesn't feel like, despite what you might see on kind of overzealous commentary about where England will go next if they beat Germany, it doesn't feel like that sort of fixture.
No, it does. I mean, it's true that it occupies more space in the English psyche than it does in the actual, like quite a few things occupies more space in the English psyche than it does in the actual observable physical reality. I mean, it does, as you say, there is a lot of history. I mean, for me, my first tournament as a fan, as someone watching football, I was 8 years old, and it was the 1970 World Cup. And even I'm not old enough to remember 66. Obviously, I've watched it since. But and the 1970 was it sort of set the tone, really. England were the best team in the world apart from Brazil. That's the thing people forget. But you know, England were the other team Brazil was worried about. Alf Ramsey thinks it was a better team than 1970, and I think that's probably right. And we were in quarterfinal, 2-0 up against Germany, and we were missing Peter Shilton, who was the best goalie in the world by universal consent, because he got the shits the night before. So Peter Bonetti, who's kind of semi-ironically known as the Cat, who was the Chelsea goalie, was subbed in, and we were 2-0 up. I think it was barely 20 minutes to go, 15 minutes to go. And the thing that the England footballers said about Mexico, who played at altitude, they said, you get used to the altitude, you don't get used to the heat. And with 20, I think it was, minutes to go, Ramsey took off Bobby Charlton because he wanted to preserve him for the semi-final. And one of the odd things about Charlton was because he had the world's worst comb over, and he looked older than he was. He was an astonishing athlete. He could run all day, but he did look a bit wizened and a bit knackered. And so Ramsey took him off to save him for the semi-final, and England leaked 3 goals. All of them slightly weird. There was a sort of Beckenbauer basically side-footed it from about 25 meters, and it sort of bubbled past Bonetti. And then there was a kind of bizarre back header from this player called Uwe Seeler, which looped into that. And then this goal with Gerd Müller volleying it past Bonetti. And there's an image of Bonetti's arm sort of like that, and Müller volleying it through. And someone said it sort of set the tone for the 1970s in Britain. I think the general election was 4 days later, and Wilson directly said, that Labour would have won that. Heath won. Wilson said, Labour would have won if we'd won the football match. And that thing about Germany being the heartbreak team, I think that's where that narrative came from. That feeling that they had, I don't know, it was a kind of an ability to keep going to the end. And then the next trauma was 1990, going out in penalties in Italia 90, which you remember. Then 96, again going out in penalties. That was the one where Southgate famously missed it. And then the only other time we've met in competitive fixtures at a major tournament was the 2010 World Cup, when Frank Lampard scored a wonderful long-range goal. The ball hit the crossbar, came down and went out, that the ref didn't give. And I think we might have won that match if we'd had that momentum, but it went the other way and we lost 4-1, which is England's worst ever defeat in a World Cup. So Germany really do have that historic status as the team that basically breaks the English national team's heart. And that's, I think, why it's so charged today.
I think this, yeah, and it kind of, you touched on this kind of idea of this rivalry and of rivalries, and there's, I actually just read it before we came on, the Simon Cooper's piece in the FT recently, talking about the changing nature of rivalries, and as Europe changes, we're even talking about France and Switzerland last night, as teams take on characters of emigration, of diasporas, they look less like, a representative purely of some vision of, say, Teutonic Germans versus Anglo-Saxons. It doesn't look like that in a football pitch. But it does feel like, I think the psyche aspect of England-Germany is really fascinating. Like, it's kind of, and even when England do well against them, I was at 5-1 and Michael Owen scored 3 or 4 goals in either a Euros or World Cup qualifier. They have beaten Germany, but it never seems to heal some of these wounds. And, obviously it's partly, I guess, you've got histories of the war, but I think you're right. I think that I'd love to know, even up until 1970, did Germany occupy this place as the great rival of the English football team? My guess is probably they didn't.
No, it didn't. I don't think Germany had beaten England. And there was a friendly in something like 1967-68 that I think was the first time Germany had beaten England in a match. I think, I know Germany pretty well. I was born in Germany, in fact, and the Germans don't see it as this. They think it's funny, which actually, from a certain perspective, it is. To have this recurrent, especially the penalties thing. They think it's absolutely hilarious. There was an odd thing though about. I saw that Simon Cooper piece. I sort of half agreed with it, and I think there's a tension though between. On the question of meaning, because the players have seen repeatedly get asked about this thing, and they get asked about the history, and they're very firm in, they deny everything. They say, no, completely not, don't care. I was just reading the paper just now, and Southgate was saying his players couldn't care less. Made the point that someone like Jude Bellingham was born a year before England's appearance in Euro 2004. So, as 1996, they don't exactly loom large. But there's the odd thing is that the meaning for the fans comes from the past. The narrative comes from the past and from those other great matches. And so there's a kind of tension between what the game means to the players, which is very much, I think, in the present tense, and them, them making their story as players. I think Southgate talked about that. You can make these memories for the whole country. But from the fans' point of view, they are, in a sense, the players don't own the meaning of the fixture. I suppose that's what I'm saying. It's that tension you often get in football. The owners think they own the club, but actually it's the fans who really own it.
It feels like that's been one of the kind of seems, like slightly subcutaneous seems of this entire tournament actually has in some ways been a tension between, to be honest, like the players and the fans, partly in terms of the fans who are in stadiums, and we've not seen that much because of the pandemic for a year and a half. So in some ways it's a new thing. But like, if you take, for example, the taking of the knee, the problem for England was that, Southgate was very much behind it. The players are very much behind it, but the fans, and it was the England fans, and actually the kind of England fans who have season tickets for England, who follow England around, who were booing it. So you have inherent in that is a tension between the meaning as it stands for footballers, the meaning as it stands for the fans, and also I think a bit of a clash between, you started off as a football writer before the kind of, the post-Taylor report English game, the post-fever pitch English game, where it was a very different beast. I'm kind of wondering if, there's also kind of a bit of a throwback to that different era of what football was seen for some people too. It wasn't something that was as mass market it is now. And fans often occupied a kind of an interesting nebulous grey zone where kind of behaviours and political views that weren't really in the mainstream and weren't tolerated were expressed.
Well, there was, it's absolutely right. I mean, I remember there was a period in the 80s when England, was the worst football hooligans in Europe, worst football hooligans in the world. And some foreign hooligans would wave the Union Jack. It became a kind of, I think it was the Union Jack rather than the Cross of St. George. That's what my memory is. And it was a kind of Jolly Roger of international football hooliganism. It's saying, which is a shameful position to have got to. And I had various friends who go to away games, and there was a game in the east of Turkey. I can't remember which stadium it was in, and it was slightly typical of England away games that the only people there were fascists and old Etonians on the gap year, who kind of travel, who were kind of doing that old Etonian thing of walking from Stockholm to Tashkent, and that was a strange period. I mean, part of me, the thing that has happened, football is much more middle class than it was, and much more corporate, and part of me does miss that thing about it was a working class game that really had deep connections with the communities where people played, and people tended to play for their local club. But it was angrier, it was darker, it was more racist. It was, could be properly frightening. I had a friend who used to live in New Cross, used to go to Millwall matches, and a little bit careful going into and out of the stadium and all that. That I don't miss. But the sort of thing where it's a game that, you see that stream of logos around the side of the thing, and that kind of the cleaning up of football, I don't see as, I mean, there were things that were lost in that process as well, particularly as, it's got, there's one kind of politics allowed the players take the knee, but we were talking about this before we went live, UEFA cracked down ruthlessly on that most feared symbol of all, the rainbow flag, which is some bullshit thing about not pissing off Hungary. So that is very unlovely, the mixture of the, sanitized corporate and, only certain sorts of gesture allowed in politics.
Yeah, it does. This tournament, in some ways, I think that the reputation laundering aspect of this tournament, I'm always fascinated in the work I do about London's role as the kind of laundry mat, not just for money, but for reputations as well. And I was struck, Baku, Wales were playing in Baku, and watching television coverage of, I think it was the first Welsh game, and one of the commentators said, it's so lovely here in Azerbaijan, and petrol is only 37 pence a litre or something. And I was like, you do realise you're in an authoritarian state run by a cabal around a strongman. And this is incredible opportunity to reputation launder. There's a huge opportunity, and those kind of advertising hoardings, Gazprom, this isn't at this championship, but I'm always struck by Visit Rwanda at the Emirates, Paul Kagame's Rwanda. So this is all fine and dandy. We won't have any issues with this sort of corporate, with these kind of corporate aspects of it. And I do think that's the tension between that. We were talking about this too before we went on, which probably the most political or the most highly charged political gesture wasn't the German player going up to the Hungarian fans at the game the other night with kind of showing the kind of equality love symbol because of the ban on marriage equality in Hungary. It was actually Ronaldo moving aside a couple of bottles of Coke and saying, I drink water instead. The share price of Coca-Cola goes down a few billions, and I'm sure behind the scenes, all manner of paroxysms at UEFA headquarters. What are we going to do now? One of our corporate sponsors is going to be really, really irate.
Yeah, that was such an interesting moment, and it was an interesting moment partly because it was about power. I don't think anybody on earth has more Instagram followers than Ronaldo. I think I'm correct in saying. I think it's 125 million people. I mean, I went to Madeira a few years ago, and not only is there a Cristiano Ronaldo museum, not only is there a Cristiano Ronaldo hotel, which I didn't go to my lasting regret, with the bar is called Offside, but the airport is named after him, and that's really astonishing. Yes, John Lennon Airport, Ronald Reagan International Airport, but not only is Ronaldo still alive, Ronaldo's still playing, and they named an airport after him. And it was really interesting that it takes someone with that much power to be able to just move the Coke bottle. I mean, it's an incredible moment. Helped, it has to be said, by the fact that whatever it was, a couple of days later, I mean, that for me, if I had to have one, although the matches last night were thrilling, but I had to save one vignette from the tournament so far, it was that goal of Ronaldo's. I think it was it against Germany? Against Belgium, perhaps? Trying to remember. But when he won, the corner came in, he won the defensive header on the edge of his 5-yard box, 5 meter, and then looked up and could see that it was on, and then he just put the foot on the accelerator, and it was like a Formula One car going past the other players, and then his next touch was to be on the receiving end of the ball in the opponent's 5-yard box for a tap in. So he wins a header in his 5-yard box, and his next touch is a tap in at the other. I've never seen that. I've watched a lot of football in my life. I've never seen anyone do that. And that sense of, as I said, it was like Formula One when he put his foot on the accelerator and was just burning past them. And I must admit, I thought, fucking hell, I'm drinking water now. That's what you can do. It was probably. Did you see that?
I did. But I must say, in this tournament, actually, I've become increasingly interested in Ronaldo's whole backstory too. His father fought, as far as I understand, fought in the Angolan War, was very embittered by it. He, in his earliest career, when he came from Madeira, seen as being backwards, he went to Lisbon. It was kind of frowned upon as a bumpkin. And it was only when he went to United, basically someone said to him, look, you can't just be a step over. If that's your entire career, and you think of all those really talented footballers, I think of it even, you've seen so many talented footballers. I for my sins, I'm a fan of Hibernian, which has produced a hell of a lot of really good footballers. I remember I've seen a lot of talented young footballers who've never really gone, not as good as Ronaldo, but no one ever really said to them, actually, or they never took it on board. Like, just being a bit skillful isn't probably going to get it for you. And he went and did all this stuff, and and bulked himself up and turned himself into exactly what you described, this Ferrari. And his statistics for over the age of 30 are way better than they were from before he was 30. Like, you would never imagine, I have to say, I watched that man at the age of 36 and I go, that's not too far off my age. And I think it would take me 2 or 3 times as long to run that length of pitch he's done. It's quite phenomenal. I think there's a tendency to almost underplay that, and to see, because he has the steeliness, because we do quite like the mercurial, we like Messi. In football, we do gravitate towards the Maradonas, even in Britain, Zola, these players who've seen, and we could almost see a little bit of an England squad with Jack Grealish. We want the guy with his socks around his ankles who doesn't look like he's trying that hard. And Ronaldo clearly thinks about every single aspect of everything. From what he puts into his body, to how he plays, to how he puts himself around the pitch. I think all of those things, it's fascinating to watch. Yes,
and it's that thing that in that extraordinary documentary about Michael Jordan, The Last Dance, and Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. Apparently, Jordan was almost dementedly competitive in training. Every time he trained as if it was, the NBA Finals. He's absolutely maxed out all the time. And Ronaldo is completely that person. He's, right. And he actually contradicts that thing of Carl Miller's thing about the most talented player being the most temperamental, because there are those counterexamples. The people he's never off. He's always at full whack. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. Will asks, how has the now fairly widespread admiration for the German way in the UK altered the dynamic of the rivalry? I'd be interested to know what you thought about that, Peter. I think that coaching has got more international, and it has got, you don't get this thing about really dramatic contrasts of style anymore. Partly because someone said, I think it might even have been Simon Cooper in that piece, you mentioned that in terms of the market for talent, football is extraordinarily fluid, perhaps especially in Europe. People cross borders, coaches cross borders, and ideas cross borders very freely. So you had that thing of Dutch football being a huge influence on Spanish football through Johan Cruyff in Barcelona, and now being a big influence on English football, especially through Pep Guardiola at Man City. So some of that stuff about these very distinct national schools has eroded, and quite a few of the talented young English players could fit in any continental format.
I think there's something interesting there as well about the kind of wider German way. Like, John Kampfer brought out that book recently about why, basically, I can't remember the title of it, why we all admire Germany. And I think even, you're right about the crossing borders, but probably, we've managed to go over half an hour without mentioning Brexit, which I think is pretty good. But if you think about the John Bosman ruling, one of the things that people, I think, for a lot of people, might just symbolize as something more than, say, joining the single market, in terms of that was a moment where people could go, oh, something's changed here. Before, our teams had to have a certain number of indigenous players, or whatever you want to, homegrown players, and now it's a free-for-all. So I think the Bosman ruling, even though it kind of seemed to have really actually had a cataclysmic effect on Mr. Bosman's life, did change that. And I think there's something interesting about a certain type of admiration for Germany writ large, for Angela Merkel's Germany, for Germany as a kind of counterpoise to the Britain of Boris Johnson and the Britain of Brexit. How true that is, I think, is another question. But I think it's quite interesting. I think there's been a tendency, I've lost count of the number of people I know who've left London to move to Berlin, for example. There's a whole kind of expat community of East London, Berlin, and many others too. And I think there's something interesting in that too, that Germany is seen as somehow embodying values around politics, around not just sport, that have changed how we look upon Germany in that time. It's gone from a kind of seen as just being a doer place to being a place that has kind of does things in a way that we should aspire to. And maybe that's, I think that's right. I think there might be something in it.
No, I totally think that's right. I think in a way there's a generational thing about people whose attitudes to Germany weren't defined by the Second World War, and that's increasingly young people now. It's not what their idea of Germany is at all. And there is that sense of Germany, in a way, having gone back to what it was before the war, which was a place that people traveled, they recognized a kind of cultural commonality. You see that very interesting thing of, middle-class people going on continental holidays would routinely go to Germany as their place of choice, as opposed to going south towards the sun. And with the kind of that shift in attitudes, people start thinking of Germany as a kind of counterfactual, another northern, a kind of quite mercantile, quite capitalistic, quite commonsensical, quite empirical northern European country that is nonetheless, has significant differences. I mean, the Berlin thing is properly interesting. And the thing that always breaks my brain a little bit when I'm in Germany, and you talk about, because Berlin is now where, as you say, it's not just East London hipsters who go there. That's where the filmmakers go, web developers, musicians, writers, everyone goes. And you ask them why, and they say, well, because it's cheaper. And that slightly, if you're British, that slightly breaks your brain. It's like talking to someone in Loughborough who's moving to Camden because it's cheaper. And that does really interesting things to the kind of energy of a place. Of a capital city as a place people can move to and kind of try out a new version of themselves, which has long since, stopped being true in London, since it became so, captured by money.
No, I totally agree. And I think this, as someone who grew up in rural Ireland in the 80s, and you were told we were taught German because that's where the jobs will be when you grow up, which pay properly.
That's interesting.
Bringing on a little bit as well, I see Marie's got an interesting question here as well, which is probably quite timely depending on what today's game goes. She's asking, can rivalry survive a run of uninspiring matches? Maybe more relevant to England versus Scotland, ... And I think there is an interesting question there. We had I'm speaking to you from Scotland, and we had Scotland 0, England 0. I was very struck, actually. In Scotland, that was seen as a great game of football. Actually, almost as actually on a slightly analytical level, that was a very good game of football that Scotland won, inverted commas. Everybody else I know saw that and thought that was a terrible game of football. I never want to see it repeated. It's been the worst game of the tournament. So I did actually watch it in my local bar. So maybe that did kind of contribute to the sense in which I thought, well, this is quite entertaining. But I think there is what's interesting about it as much as that, and it's the same, I think, for Ireland and England, but actually particularly for Scotland and England, because it's bound up with all these questions, I think, about identity, about history, but also in a way that's changing too, because I think if you look, say, until 1997, obviously there was no Scottish Parliament in Holyrood in the year of association football. So football became the totemic thing within which some rivalry could exist between England and Scotland. And I was really struck in the build-up to the games in Scotland that actually there was an entire national conversation, albeit in place, about, is this anti-Englishness good for us? Should we continue this anti-Englishness? Should we all support anybody but England once Scotland goes out inevitably? And I think there's been a kind of changing of the guard, I think, about, at least in some quarters, about how Scotland feels about that game. Whereas I think for England, they don't, in that way that larger nations, and the kind of famous Pierre Trudeau quote about Canada and America being in bed with an elephant. In England, I think there isn't probably, I don't know, you could probably speak to this more, John, there isn't the same sense of rivalry around Scotland, because it's almost embarrassing that little Scotland should be seen as your real rivals, whereas you would want to be seen as having rivals like Germany, like France, like Italy, like large footballing nations who go on to win things, even if England don't.
I think the thing about England, so I should say I'm my other nationality is Irish. My mum was Irish from County Mayo, so I have a slight double perspective on that. I think one of the things, and for instance in rugby, I support Ireland partly because I find the thing of 80,000 Tories singing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" at Twickenham, I just my gorge rises. I can't take it. Everybody wants to beat England. They are the team to beat in its primary sports, cricket and rugby in particular. They are, they have this sort of, for historic reasons, they're kind of everybody's favourite villain. So I think the English fans are deeply aware of that thing about the particular animus that, as you say, used to be there from Scotland. But you're right. I think that the increased number of ways of having a Scottish identity, sense of nationhood, sense of agency, I get the strong impression that it's taken the edge off that. I mean, an analogy might be in Spain in the Franco years. The only form of Catalan identity you were allowed, the language was banned, all that, was supporting Barcelona. So there are I know, you know, Catalans of that generation, the generation who are around under the dictatorship, who are, you know, make any form of British football partisanship seem completely trivial. You know, they're beyond, these are kind of cultural reasonable, you know, people in their 60s who are just beyond nuts about Barcelona. And it's because it was their only thing. You know, the only way you could have a sense of Catalan identity was, the only thing that was allowed was supporting the football team. So I wonder if something like that, there's been a kind of slight shift in Scotland around that there's sort of other ways of feeling Scottish rather than just, you know, doing England over at football and then tearing up the pitch at Wembley. And maybe, by the way, some of it was partly a kind of reaction to that. There was a kind of, we're getting a bit carried away here, lads, feeling about it.
The one thing I will say, we move on a sec, is what I found quite interesting is how actually British Unionism is now struggling with how to take, because of its turn. I think it's become much more muscular under Boris Johnson. There's a lot, I don't know, there's actually seems to be a diktat, which I read about recently, that we're going to stop talking about four nations and start talking about one country, one state. And this has been a real tension, as someone, you know, and it's a tension I've probably written about quite a bit over the years. But like, as an outsider, I'm particularly interested in it. And if you look at it now, there's a struggle to find a language to talk about this. So when Boris Johnson tried to wish everybody well in the House of Commons, he said, oh, the home nations, England and Scotland, and he forgot about Wales. And then recently he actually was asked about, he said, no, we're one nation, kind of basically saying there is no home nation. So it's like the language and the architecture for which once actually, for I think football, the home nations tournament back in the day actually epitomized a very, very type of British unionism that has allowed these different expressions in different parts of the union. And as that has started to collapse and be replaced by a kind of Anglo-British nationalism, there isn't really a language that allows for these nations to talk about each other within the context of the British Union. And so rather than it being an opportunity, I think, for independent supporters in Wales or Scotland or Ireland or nationalists to flex their muscles, it's just showing up a problem for kind of the central British state because it's not really able to accommodate a conversation about them.
I think that's right. I mean, I think part of what you're seeing there, though, is a kind of Brexit panic about Brexit potentially breaking the union, and you have that paradoxical thing. I get the quite strong impression that a thing you're not allowed to say about Scotland is that the SNP has actually drawn some courage from Brexit, because Brexit has happened, and actually, you know, it isn't Mad Max. You know, there are things, you know, get stopped at the border and whatever, but it suddenly isn't the end of the world. And it's a thing you're absolutely not allowed to say, because the SNP is never going to say that they drew inspiration from it, and the Tories are never going to say, the Brexiters are never going to say, yeah, yay, we're helping break up the union. You know, but there is this sort of zone of silence around how to talk about Britishness when the the imperatives of English nationalism have just completely overridden what people in Northern Ireland want, what people in Scotland want. I mean, it's a strange sort of moment of sort of saying the quiet part loud, really. So here's a question from Rusty. I think we might have time for one more, but Rusty says, aren't we all rooting for Denmark given what happened to Christian Eriksen? Or is it only the fans from teams that have already been eliminated? Portugal, in my case. I'm definitely rooting for Denmark as a backup team. I suppose it raises the question of, you know, who does everyone have? Is it compulsory to have a backup team? Is it compulsory to have a backup team? What's your approach to that, Peter?
I find myself, it's hard, you know, I always find myself being drawn towards, unsurprisingly, the underdog in some of these in games, like even to the point where I'm almost, yesterday, for example, in Sweden against or Switzerland against France, I was like, go on, score Switzerland. Then I was like, do I want Switzerland? Do I want France to go out? You know, do I not want to see them again? And so there's a point where you go, wow, what do I really want to happen? But I think until yesterday, I thought Christensen, the Chelsea player's goal against Russia for Denmark was probably the moment of the tournament. And I think, you know, what you'd seen was, it was absolutely, obviously, shocking. And I think it's easy to forget just how shocking those images from the pitch were. I was watching that game live, and I think everybody who watched it it really was so shocking, and it was incredible that something he was able to be up in bed within a couple of hours talking about it.
Yeah.
And then they played on in a time when I think most people, they looked and gone, I really don't think you should play on, guys. And retrospectively, they lost that game against Finland. They then were beaten unluckily by Belgium too. And so it looked like Denmark were going out, and you could see it was a good Danish team. And it has been, I think you'd have to be a Welsh fan not to begrudge them, because they really annihilated Wales a couple of days ago. 4-0, looked really good. And I think actually on every level, it's hard not to root for Denmark, because they play nice football. They've got this incredible backstory, and they've seemed to have this incredible cohesion as a team as well. I think even the way they responded to what happened to Christian Eriksen on the pitch, kind of made me go, I would be drawn to them. And I probably am somebody who does end up with 3 or 4 second teams. I think I end up with a second big team, a second little team, and a kind of probably a second outsider team. So I probably got Italy, Denmark, and on the back of yesterday, I've probably got a little bit of soft spot for Switzerland. So I'm a bit too promiscuous to kind of just be left with one.
You're hedging your bets. No, I would like. The funny thing about England is I'm not at all invested before the tournament, but you get slightly caught up as it goes. And the problem is that they are playing quite boringly. And back to Marie's point, I think this has the potential to be. It could be a really dull game. It could just not catch fire. England have been pretty boring so far, and you enjoyed the Scotland match, but I was watching it in Cornwall, and we were streaming it over ITV Hub, and the best bits were when the Wi-Fi went down. That was the most entertaining, most dramatic thing that happened in the 90 minutes I saw. But I think after I would like Denmark, partly because I think I've looked for more than a kind of team B apart, because for me it's England, Germany, because I was born there, and Ireland because I'm half Irish. But then it's the story you look for. It's the story that catches you up and takes you along. And funnily enough, last time Denmark actually won it, they were put in the tournament because Yugoslavia ceased to exist because of the Civil War, and then they went on to win. So, I think a lot of neutrals and semi-neutrals, and about to become neutrals when your team gets knocked out, are rooting for Denmark. Who I happened to notice, I was looking at my... I sometimes, in a small way, bet on football just to keep the adrenaline levels up, and I noticed that 11 to 1.
That's quite nice. They're not. I'm looking at them.
They're better than 11 to 1. I'd say
they are, and they've clearly got that incredible mix of, as you say, this narrative, this incredible narrative, plus a really bloody good team. But also, maybe I noticed a couple of Brentford players there. I'm pretty sure have gone up to the Premiership this year, which makes Brentford
they're no mugs.
Pretty good too.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. And thank you very much for joining us. I've been asked to make a housekeeping announcement about upcoming matches, and that is that there's nothing to announce because the bookshop doesn't know what the plan is yet. The LOB hasn't decided, but the next games, as I'm sure everyone knows, are Friday and Saturday. 5 p.m, 8 p.m. Friday, 5 p.m, 8 p.m. Saturday. And so watch this space. I'm sure they'll be doing something, but they haven't quite decided what yet because we don't know what the matches are. And just to say, it's weird when the matches stop. So Wednesday and Thursday are going to stretch out. They're going to feel long. They're going to feel dark. They're going to feel empty. I recommend don't try and compensate with alcohol, drugs, and casual sex. Just breathe through it. The previous games are available on iPlayer and ITV Hub if you want to rewatch things. And let's look forward to the next round and to let's hope what's coming up lives up to what we've had so far, because it's been fantastic. So I'll just say thanks very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Peter, and onwards and upwards. See you in front of the telly.